Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today we have with us Dr. Surajit Majumdar, who teaches in Ambedkar University. Surajit, the budget of course has been a major event, as it always is. What are the major features of this budget? Does it have something for the consumers? Does it have something for the working class, the peasantry? Or is it as a budget as usual, which is really for the corporate sector, which has been on top of the budget for now almost last 20, 25, 30 years?
Well, it can't be called a budget as usual because of the economic context to this particular budget, where you have serious macroeconomic problems as far as the economy is concerned, which have emerged over time through a process which has not done very much to lift the standards of living of the vast majority of this country's people. So, without even that gain, we have reached a point where we have simultaneously a problem of a widening current account deficit. So, we have foreign exchange commitments to meet, which we are not able to earn. We have inflation, and particularly food inflation, persisting, and we also have a process where growth and investment are slackening. So, simultaneously we have all these three problems. So, given that background, the budget acquires a significance which it might not otherwise have. The government and the finance minister has made very clear from both the revisions in the estimates from what was budgeted last year in terms of expenditures, as well as what has been budgeted for the coming year, is that the government is committed to cutting expenditures or holding expenditures in check in order to meet a target of the fiscal deficit, which they want to reduce progressively every year. So, in the last year they have cut a whole set of expenditures which they had committed to doing in the budget in order to ensure that the fiscal deficit remains at 5.2%. Once you had a situation that revenues were falling below projections and because the economy was slow.
Cuts really went on the social expenditure.
Expenditures which are relevant to developing the productive capacity of the economy in the long run, expenditures which are relevant to a large majority of India's working population. These are the expenditures which have taken the hit. And if we go by that last year's experience and take into account what is likely in the coming year, because if you are going to follow a policy where you are going to keep expenditures under check or cut expenditures, and you are also simultaneously trying to keep the fiscal deficit down, then you are really not doing anything through this exercise to improve the prospects for growth even in an aggregate sense. So, if this tendency continues, then we may see even in the coming year revenues falling short of what has been budgeted. And if they do exactly what they did last year, they will cut expenditures beyond the levels they have already budgeted.
Also, you anticipate if the revenue shortfalls continue, and there are good reasons why that should be expected to continue. In that case, you expect even the commitments being made in this budget for investments of infrastructure, for instance, for health, education, etc., to be cut even more.
Yes.
In that context, the growth is likely to be dismal, and it's already down to about 4.5%
in the last quarter.
So, this is likely to continue. So, we are going to see both lack of investments in vital infrastructure, which is the bottleneck in the economy, social sector, as well as low growths. This is one side of the budget.
This is one side of the budget, but what makes it even more dangerous is the external sector situation of the Indian economy. Foreign investors have to be kept happy because you have a large payments gap to be met, which can only be met if foreign investors bring money into India. So, in order to make them happy, you are very particular about the fiscal deficit. But if in the process you get this combination of three things, of a large current account deficit, high rates of inflation, as well as slackening growth, then these three results of the fiscal deficit may have exactly the same effect which you are trying to prevent by keeping the fiscal deficit low.
So, effectively you not only make the people unhappy as a consequence of this, but for whom you are going to make happy, you are making the people unhappy, they will not be happy either if the economy doesn't grow. And this is the really what's going to happen.
Yes, and if that point is reached where they start thinking that this is not the place to park their money and they start taking it out, then at that point of time you might be forced into a situation where the economy will have to undergo a severe contraction in order to simply restore some of these balances.
Surajit, coming to the other issue, the revenue side, there are a lot of projections on the revenue side which do not seem to be realistic. One, of course, is that under conditions where already the market is sagging, you want to offload public sector equities and generate 50,000 crores. You think the spectrum will sell. Now, there are good reasons why at the current moment the spectrum sales may not attract buyers. You already have a cartel of parties coming together, not willing to bid because their licenses are up for grabs anyway after a year. So, they don't want the prices, at least the airwaves prices, to rise right now. Given this context, do you see the revenue side of Chidambaram's budget being realistic?
The revenue projections would be realistic if you were doing something to raise the rates on various segments of taxpayers, and you were doing something on the expenditure side which would make growth more likely, because revenues don't just depend on the rates but also on the extent of growth that happens. Since you're not doing anything to promote that growth and you're not raising rates either, there's no reason for these revenue projections to be realistic. And last year's experience is worth keeping in mind in this regard, because last year the revenues have actually fallen below what was projected, and a similar set of revenue projections have been made for the coming year as were made last year. So, the shortfall that we saw last year is likely to be repeated this year. At least there is nothing in the budgetary exercise which would prevent that from happening. If for other fortuitous reasons things become better, it is a different matter. The only other way that some of these revenue projections may be met is if you have high rates of inflation. You don't have growth, but high rates of inflation, in which case you might get the revenues in terms of the numbers, but in real terms those revenues and the expenditures that you are going to make with them, in real terms they become much less. What should have actually been done is, particularly in the case of direct taxes, in the case of income taxes as well as corporate taxes, there was scope to significantly raise the rates. We have our highest marginal tax rate and income tax at 30%. There is a case for increasing that for at least incomes above, say, around 20 lakhs. They have done a marginal thing for those above 1 crore, which is pittance. It doesn't.
It's only 42,000 people.
Yeah,
in many
it's
cases.
only 42,000 people, and it's not very much. Corporate income tax also, they have just increased one surcharge, which is again a marginal measure. It doesn't change the effective tax rate very significantly, and corporate taxes effective tax rate is actually only around 23%, whereas the statutory rate is 33% because of various concessions that are there. So, neither have they done anything to remove the concessions. They have in fact given an additional concession in terms of investment allowance. So, the effective tax rate on corporates has remained low. So, options were available to raise additional revenues from these sources, which have not been exercised. There was also a case, there is also a very important case for doing this, that comes from the observation of the problems that the India's economy is facing today. Because what is the root cause of the problems? The root cause of the problems is that the spending ability in India is too heavily concentrated in the hands of some individuals and corporations. So, when they spend it in a manner which gives rise to excessive imports. Imports which you cannot finance, because at the moment the global economy is not in a condition where you are being able to export sufficiently to meet the costs of those imports. You also have this spending ability, it does not go to every area. So, a huge set of important areas where the economy has a deficit, whether it is in the public infrastructure, in agriculture, in social services, not enough money goes there, because those who have the money to spend are not interested in spending in those areas. So, partly the inflationary process which is driven by food prices is caused by that you have not had for a long period of time enough investment in agriculture. And thirdly, when they can invest, where they can put this money, invest it productively in sectors like manufacturing, then they find that the rest of the economy doesn't have the buying power to buy the products that they may produce. So that's what is the reason why you have a collapse of investment, because manufacturing is an important sector where the investment might happen, but that capacity that is created in manufacturing just simply doesn't have a market either within India or outside. So therefore, all these problems actually required a change in the direction of expenditure in the economy, and which had to require changes in where the expenditure was coming from. So it had to move from the top rungs of Indian society downwards, and from the private sector to the state. These are the two directions of movement of the expenditure that are necessary if these fundamental problems that India is facing today have to be addressed. And that's the only viable basis for growth and development in the long run.
Of course, the other issue which has always been there, the manufacturing sector can also pick up only when there is good infrastructure. You cannot provide power, your rates of power are proving to be one of the highest in the world. Under such conditions, even if you do get it, and if you don't, then you burn diesel. Diesel prices have again gone up for bulk users. So if you take all that into account, the only area where you can do is services, where you only use telecommunication infrastructure and not basic infrastructure like roads and power, electricity. And that bottleneck is still going to continue.
That bottleneck is going to continue. So both on the infrastructure side as well as on the demand side. So you have this tendency where there is very little prospect for long-term growth of industry. Okay. Services position is relatively better, because as the rich are becoming richer, their spending pattern is also changing. More and more is being spent on services, relatively less on manufactured products. Whereas those who would buy manufactured products, they don't, just not getting the money, purchasing power to get it. So you have this pattern in India where expenditure is shifting towards services at a time when per capita consumption of manufactured consumption goods in India is extremely low by international standards, any comparison you would make with other countries. But yet you have this shift towards services because it's all coming from the rich. So both sides are not allowing industry to dominate our growth.
Develop, forget dominate, even develop under the
develop. So therefore, if you see India's growth that is being talked about is also being held up by services. Industry and agriculture are both growing in the last year at under 2%. So if you were an industrial economy, you would have been said that you are in deep recession already.
Coming to the other aspect, which is the speculative part of the economy, the black economy. Estimates today are that 50% of India's GDP is effectively a part of the black economy, leading to round tripping. Money goes from here to under invoicing, over invoicing, goes abroad, comes back as so-called foreign investments via principally the Mauritius route. No effort to plug the Mauritius route. Last year there was one sentence looking at it. This year the sentence has again come back, and again Chidambaram has said, we're really not going to do it.
It's very clear that they are not very serious about plugging that particular route. And if they had been serious, then one would have seen greater efforts to ensure that the revenue that should accrue to the government accrues. So they'll keep referring to evasion as a means of keeping rates low. They'll keep talking about the fact that there are a large number of people who are outside the tax net, and that they should be tapped rather than taxing those who are already in the net. But they forget that even those who are in the net are evading taxes on a colossal scale. So companies are in the net, they are not outside the net, but they are very much part of that process. Where is that round tripping happening from? Where is that money coming in through that round tripping?
Well, a part of the helicopter deal we saw, the round tripping is
clearly.
So
it's even people who are in the net are managing to evade taxes on a very large scale.
In fact, the largest expansion of the black economy has taken place simultaneously with dropping the tax rates from post-90s. That's again the reports that have now come.
In fact, if you take into account what has happened to income distribution in India, the extent to which there has been trickle up rather than trickle down, if taxes were being actually paid as they should have been paid, one should have seen a very significant increase in the tax to GDP ratio as a counterpart of increasing inequality. And in the last 5 years, actually the 2007-8, at the time that the crisis erupted, as part of the fiscal stimulus, taxes were brought down. The tax to GDP ratio fell, and even till date, there has not been any recovery to those levels. What has happened is instead you forced the expenditures back to those levels. So, your withdrawal from the fiscal stimulus has been entirely on the expenditure side, and no serious effort has been made to actually generate revenues.
Last question. This 4.8% fiscal deficit, this focus on the fiscal deficit, how serious is it as an economist? Do you think the fiscal deficit really matters to the extent the current economic orthodoxy, particularly the rating agencies, seem to believe?
No, I don't think that the fiscal deficit or this fetishism about the fiscal deficit has any basis. As I said, this particular budget is an indication of the fact that the process of trying to cut the fiscal deficit might actually produce precisely the results that you're trying to avoid by cutting the fiscal deficit. So, it's not really about those consequences, but really about ensuring that the state does not intervene too much in the processes of the economy, so that those who are able to corner a large share of what is produced, okay, that there is no significant intervention which prevents that from happening. So, that's the real issue as far as the fiscal deficit is concerned.
Complete aside, if this is the state of the economy, and if this is the way we are looking at expenditure, we are looking at subsidies and so on, is there any logic to the argument, which I believe the Prime Minister himself is also interested in, of increasing the gas prices in India to international levels?
Well, if they follow this policy that ultimately prices of should reflect the international prices as they are falling in oil, then the natural logic of that decision making will also extend to gas.
Rough estimate, 70,000 crores subsidy to Mr. Ambani and 70,000 crores subsidy taken away from fertilizers and other areas?
Could be, definitely.
That's not seen as a subsidy.
No, that's not seen as a subsidy. That's not seen as a subsidy. And you see, even when as to the fiscal deficit is concerned, you can close the fiscal deficit from two sides. You can increase revenues or you can reduce expenditures. But it is never about the revenues, it is always about the expenditures. If the state is kept in check through this ideology of the fiscal deficit, then the state has to keep the property sections happy so that they invest, they spend and they drive growth. That's the condition that they want to maintain. That's the reason why this preoccupation with the fiscal deficit.
Thank you very much, Surojit. If this is the direction of the Indian economy, I'm sure we'll have more discussions with you on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.